I am Chuck C. and I'm an alcoholic. Hi. I was ready to go home a half an hour ago. I rather wish I had. We're going to have to quit important speakers around here. I can get along pretty well with this crowd that I know well and can make fun of, you know. But when these foreigners come in, crack you up, there ain't nothing you can do but cry. That's all. I'm a substitute this morning, for which I'm glad. And I will be very happy to turn this over to a substitute if there's anybody here that wants it. It's been a beautiful, beautiful weekend for me. I knew our speakers this morning before they got here this time. But I know them better now because they were better than they've ever been. Beautiful people. There isn't any better expression of the language of the heart than we've already heard. Those of you who were here for this early meeting. It's fantastic. I was in the young people's meeting yesterday. Seemed like I identify with them a little more than I do you adults. I'm a little bit childish myself. And a little old knot-headed boy got up there, he wasn't that high. And he said, I'm an alcoholic and an addict. And it just took me down. He was 14 years old. And he's 7 months clean. Oh, it's beautiful. Beautiful. Sit up there and talk to a room full of people. 14 years old and 7 months clean. Then one of my favorites talked a while. She's down here in the front row now. Sarah. And she killed me about 6 years ago down at the desert Roundup. And she was pretty wonderful. The Canadians, we should ban them too. Tom's been calling himself my number 3 son for years, and I've disinherited him. God, he was terrific last night, wasn't he? Terrific. I don't know why we persist in calling the Sunday morning meeting a spiritual meeting. If it's an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, it's spiritual. There isn't any way that you can have an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that isn't spiritual. Because this is a spiritual program. And but for the Spirit, no one of us would be here. Because we don't get sober on profundities, we get sober on spirit, the spirit of AA. We're allowed to get sober by the Spirit, and we maintain sobriety by the practice principles. No alcoholic ever got sober on either principles or profundity. We get sober, as all of you have said, that I have heard at this conference and many others, on that sharing of experience, strength, and hope. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share. Share. Caring and sharing is Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's what makes it work. And that may be the reason that this is about the only thing there is that works for people like that. It's the identity that makes these miracle recoveries possible. We see ourselves in those who are sharing with us. And it gives us the desire to stay and be one of them. I speak of this every once in a while. How fortunate we are, we alcoholics, that we love each other. How fortunate we are that we love each other. For instance, I went to my first meeting by myself alone. I like to say by myself alone because for many years I've spent much time by myself, but I'm never alone. But that night, I was by myself alone. I didn't have any people. And I didn't know what a sponsor was. And the chap that I was talking with over the telephone, whose name I'd gotten from a doctor in Beverly Hills, was a picture man, and he was working nights, and he couldn't take me to meetings. And after the third attempt, I said to him, "You don't need to take me to a meeting. Where is there a meeting that I can go to? I'll go." And he told me where there's a meeting. And I went by myself alone. And looking at about 30 or 40 people in the middle of the room, all of them standing there yakking their heads off, nobody listening, you know, I concluded rather quickly that I'd been given the wrong information, because these people didn't look like me, and they weren't dressed like me, and they most certainly weren't talking like me, because it was all happy talk. You couldn't understand a word, but it was happy talk. So the meeting was in the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall in Beverly Hills. And I knew that these were the veterans and their wives. And they were there for a party. I had been given the wrong information. And I was going to have to leave and come back the night the drunks were there. And I turned to go. And somebody had been watching me standing in the middle of that room. And when I turned to leave, he came running over to the door. And he called to me. He says, "Mister, were you looking for somebody?" And I said, "No, sir." Well, he says, "What were you looking for then?" And thinking he was a veteran, I said, "Well, if it would interest you, sir, I was looking for sobriety." And just that quick, everything about that man changed. He lit up like a Christmas tree. And it was obvious to me that he was glad I was there. Now, I'd never seen this guy before. Total stranger to me, but I wasn't a stranger to him. Because, you see, he was a recovering alcoholic. And I was making my first trip in. And he was so glad I was there that he lit up like a Christmas tree. Well, I can assure you that everybody that knew me was glad I was there, too. But for an entirely different reason. If I was there, I couldn't be there, you see. But that wasn't the way with him. He was genuinely glad I was there, so glad that he lit up. And I was hooked before he ever opened his mouth again. And when he did, this is what came out. Why, he says, take off your hat and coat. You're in the right place. And he took me and rocked me to sleep. That's what we're talking about. How fortunate can we be that we love each other? A practicing alcoholic is not easy to love. It just about takes one to love one, doesn't it? And fortunately for us, that's it. So we share our experience, strength, and hope, one with another in love. And that's what it's all about. But for the love, we would not be here. And of course, they say God is love. And I believe it. I believe it with everything in my being. All AA meetings are spiritual. As a matter of fact, in my belief, I think that all experience is spiritual. Because I think we're spiritual beings. I've lived 31 years and 9 months with people like you. And if there's one thing that you have proven to me beyond all others, so completely that my hair and my toenails know it, we're all God's children, every one of us. Every one of us. Whether we know it or not, whether we believe it or not, even if we deny it, it don't make any difference. We're God's children. And God has always known that. But you and I have to discover it for ourselves. We have to discover it for ourselves. And many amongst us think that it was a hard road. A hard road. I drank for 25 years. And the last 10 years was hell on wheels. It was awful. And I thought it was tough. Life was tough. And my experience was awful bad. You see, I had a family. And I was drinking in a sober society. We lived in Beverly Hills. And most of the people on our block could walk. They didn't get around like I did, or failed to get around like I did. So it isn't easy to be drunk in a sober society. And it isn't easy to be a compulsive drinker, an alcoholic, in a family that you love. That ain't easy. Been much better for me if I hadn't loved him. You know? Because I knew I was crucified. Not only was I crucifying me, but I was crucifying them. And knowing that, I would hurt so bad I'd have to go and replenish my supply and keep right on crucifying them because I couldn't stand the pain. It's not easy to live the life of an alcoholic in a sober society, in a family that you love. Many years ago, when I was first yakking, I used to say that if I ever had to drink again, I was going straight to Skid Row, where it was accepted behavior. You know? I wasn't going to try to live in a sober society again. I was going right down to Skid Row, and I'd talked about that on numerous occasions from the podium. And an old boy that I know and loved so much had been on Skid Row for quite a while. And he had wired his shoes on so he'd have a pair when he came to, you know. And we were pretty close together. And one night after I had told him that I was going straight to Skid Row, he came to me. And he said to me, "Chuck, don't say that anymore." He says they wouldn't have you on Skid Row. He says when you're on Skid Row, you've got to bring in enough to pull your weight. You got to get there on the street and pick up a few dimes and quarters to continue the supply. And you can't do that. You lay drunk a month at a time. Said they'd run you right off of Skid Row. And my last haven, my last harbor, refuge, was snatched right out from under me. And I had to figure right then, well, I'm going to have to stay with these bums for the rest of my life. Here I am. Thank God I haven't had to go back. I haven't had to look back since I came to my first meeting. And I want to just tell you a little bit about it. And then I'm going to play around because if I try to get profound this morning, you're going to have to bring out the crying towels, because that's the way I feel. As many of you have heard me say, my last drunk started the Friday before Christmas, 1945. My boss called me in, and I knew that it was curtains. I knew I had it coming and that he was going to tell me to get out and stay out, but he didn't. He said to me, "Charlie," I was Charlie in business, he says, "Charlie, you've had a lot of trouble this year." And being an non-alcoholic, he knew the answer. He says, "I think it's because of the pressure you're under. And I'm going to take a little pressure off of you. And maybe next year you won't have so much pressure and you won't have so much trouble." And so instead of shooting me, as he had every right to do, he gave me $3,000 for a Christmas present to take the pressure off of me. Now, if you don't think he took the pressure off of me, you're nuts. There's only one thing worse for an alcoholic than bad fortune, and that's good fortune. I had so much pressure taken off of me that I got drunk on the way home, which was not par for the course, because I was periodic for the last 10 years that I drank. Periodics don't get drunk in a hurry. We never taper off. We taper on. And usually it'll take me from 30 to 60 days to get off my feet after I started nipping after a dry spell. So this wasn't part of the course, because I got drunk on the way home, and I remember nothing till the middle of January 1946. I don't even remember going home. And I came to sometime after the middle of January 1946 with nothing in my body but whiskey. Mrs. C would tell you that all I did for that whole time was to lie there in bed and empty bottles. Every time I opened my eyes, I drank. And I never ate when I drank. So I had nothing in my body but whiskey. Nothing. And yet I came to with the clearest head I've ever known. I was totally clear. For the first time in my life, I saw me with nothing between me and me. Everything had burned out. And I saw me as I was. And I accepted myself as I was. I knew without knowing why, because I knew nothing of Alcoholics Anonymous and nothing of alcoholism. Prior to 30 years ago, nobody knew. I knew that I'd lost the battle of life, and I accepted it. And it was the first time in my 43 years of life that I'd ever admitted defeat. Not to God, man, woman, or the devil. But I knew that morning that I had lost the battle of life. And I knew why Mrs. C had started divorce proceedings. And I knew she should have done it 10 years before. And I knew my kids wouldn't come home when I was around. And I knew why this same boss had sent word to the house that if I ever step foot in the plant again, he's going to throw me through the window. I accepted the fact that morning that everything dear to me in life was gone and should be gone, and that I was not entitled to have it back. Suddenly it became very necessary for me to be sober till I died. Not because I wanted sobriety, because I didn't. Because, you see, I knew I was going to die. I'd come that close to dying the next and the last time out. I'd gone to the kitchen after a glass of buttermilk. Mrs. C and Richard were sitting in the living room. They heard me let out a beller and heard me hit the floor, and they came running out thinking I'd be in an alcoholic convulsion, which was my wont. But I wasn't. I'd used up all my alcoholic convulsions. I didn't have any left. And I was just lying there on the kitchen floor as peaceful as anybody you ever saw. I wasn't doing nothing. They tell me I was a peculiar color. I was blue. And they couldn't wake me up. And they got all exercised and called the oxygen squad at the Beverly Hills Receiving Hospital to come down and see if they could do anything for me. Now, as serious as this is, tickled the hell out of me. Because I'm sure that Mrs. C and those boys had been praying for me to die for at least 5 years. Many of you Alanani-nannies have heard her get up and say to a bunch of people half this big that on many occasions She was seriously trying to find a way that she could do away with me permanently and not get caught. I don't think that's very nice. So they'd been praying for me to die for at least 5 years, and they came to the kitchen and found me dead. And they had to call the oxygen squad to come down and see if they could bring me to. And I have reason to believe that they did. I remember what happened when I came to. There was a young doctor with him, and he told me that to all intents and purposes I'd been dead. That they'd had a hell of a time bringing me to. That nobody would ever be able to bring me to again under those circumstances. And then he gave me the finest piece of counsel I've ever heard or ever will. He looked me right in the eye and he said, if I were you, I wouldn't do that anymore. Now I want to pass that on to all you people. If I were you, I wouldn't do that anymore. But I did it again. And the last time was worse than the next to the last time. So I knew I was going to die, and it was all right with me. I didn't care. But I didn't want to die with a record. I didn't want Mrs. C and the kids to remember me as nothing but a tongue-chewing, babbling idiot drunk. And I remembered at that point that I had discovered, that Mrs. C had discovered, Jack Alexander's article in the Post in 1941, March 1st issue, Saturday Evening Post. She had read it and thought it might be good for me, and she left it on the left arm of the chair I sit in right now, open the right page. And when I came in, I saw it, and I picked it up and read it. I remembered it that morning, but I only remembered 2 things about it, because I was 4 sheets in the wind when I read it. I remembered that drunks helped drunks and didn't drink, and they called it Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said to myself, if I ever live to get out of this bed, I'll find AA. And immediately, the curtain dropped. My sanity was gone, and I was sickened to death, drunk, and insane. And I had a lot of dying to do. But from the moment of commitment until right now, I've never had to take a drink of liquor or a sedating or tranquilizing pill of any kind. Such is the great significance of this thing called surrender. Surrender. This is the most misunderstood experience in human life. Surrender is victory for the alcoholic. Surrender is victory. This is a battle we win by knowing that we can't win it, that we have lost. Would to God it was possible for us to tell each other what it means to surrender. It can't be done. It has to happen to you to know what happens when you surrender. Surrender is victory, and that's why it's so difficult for us. Now, I told you a while ago, I believe that all experience is spiritual. I have the feeling that my last 10 years in hell was just as spiritual as my last day in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is today. Just as spiritual. Because it happened in, to, and through me. And I'm a spiritual being. You know, the book says, God is life. And it also says, God is spirit, and he that would worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And it also says that God is our Father. So, I believe that all experience is spiritual. And I believe that my last 10 years was just as necessary in my life as being born in the first place. Because I didn't spend 5 seconds in hell that wasn't absolutely necessary. I could not surrender. I would never have surrendered consciously. And now I can surrender all day and all night. And it don't bother me at all. You see, when we take step number 3, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. We enter a new dimension of life. An infinite father, an infinite child, and an infinite journey. And when you're on an infinite journey, you can't stop walking. Now, this explains a lot of experience that you and I have in this great fellowship. We stop walking, we get fat, we get complacent, and we quit walking. The reason I'm here this morning is because that happened to a man I've known and loved for 25 years. He forgot. You know, so we forget, and we get fat and complacent and quit walking, and we get caught in a wringer. And the only way we can get out of it is to surrender out of it, lest we die if we be alcoholic. Because we can't live too long when we're uncomfortable right here where we live. Because we know a way to stop that hurt, temporary though it may be. So, I got my answer. This surrender bit is the burr under the saddle. I finally found something good in the human ego. It's the burr under the saddle. It's the thing that keeps us walking. And we have to walk. On an infinite journey, you can't stop walking. You've got to walk. Life won't let us stop. So the time will never come, in my opinion, when we won't have to continuously surrender. Because as I see it, there'll always be as much ahead of us as there is right now. An infinite journey does not have a destination. And I'm so happy about that, because the destination that I was told about when I was a kid, I didn't like as well as the journey, and I didn't like the journey. You know? Heaven wasn't a very nice place, the way they told me about it. Because all I was going to do was sit there and pick on a harp and sing Hosanna to the highest. And I don't like harp music, and I can't sing. But the alternative was to go to hell. And I said to myself many times, I think that I'm going to choose hell because all the interesting people are going to be there. So it is a great joy to me to find that there is no destination. I'm so delighted with the words of Henry Drummond. He was talking to a graduating class of missionaries, and he said to them, "No man can go to heaven," and then he stopped. And he said, "You will not misunderstand me. No man can go to heaven lest he take it with him." And I believe that to be true. I believe that to be true. And if it's any better than this place where you and I are living and this group of people with which we associate and love, I wouldn't want to go there anyway. This is an awful nice place for me. I've been announcing lately that I'm going to celebrate my 62nd birthday in Alcoholics Anonymous before I take off. I like it here. And the farther I walk, the better I like it. It's fantastic. Yes, I believe every experience that we have is a spiritual experience. And when we get able to and do read the lessons out of our experience, we have a fabulous life. When it is no longer necessary for us to have somebody tell us how good we are and how nice we're doing, and we have no necessity at all to take any credit for the good things that happen in our life, and when it's not necessary for us to have a they to blame for the things that turn out badly, we're free. We're free people. And it's fabulous. They got me drunk for years. Do you know that I never had one drunk up until my last one that was my fault? Not one in 25 years. Now, it would appear that one of them would have been my fault by accident, doesn't it? That not one of them was my fault until my last one. And in my last one, I came to see that if there be fault, it's mine. And I've never had to drink anymore. What a freedom it is not to have a they to bring, to blame. I'm sort of out of places to blame because I don't happen to believe in a God of judgment. I believe in a God of love and a great law of justice without judgment. And so I can't blame God when anything bad happens to me. I can't blame him because I don't believe in a God of judgment. And I don't believe in the devil at all. Now, I'm not telling you there ain't none. I'm telling you I don't believe in one. I don't care whether there is or not. Because I'm going to so live that he couldn't get me if he wanted me. So it's no big deal as far as I'm concerned. So I can't blame the devil. And I haven't even got old Adam's excuse. You know, when he got caught with, when he got caught. You know what he said? He said, it was the woman thou gavest me, right off the bat. Thereby establishing you broads as our great excuse. It was the woman thou gavest me. If you biddies would just shape up and fly right, we wouldn't have to get drunk at you. You know that. I can't even blame my wife or my kids or conditions or circumstances, because I've lived long enough to know that my own peace cannot depend on any person, place, thing, circumstance, or condition outside of me. So what do I do when I'm off the track? No place for me to go but to come to myself. To come to myself and see what I've allowed to get important enough to get between me and my program and my God. And whatever it is, I have to discard it. Get rid of it. Because the very second that something gets more important to me than my program and my God, I'm in left field again. And I can't live in left field. So I have to eliminate it with the grace of God. And then I'm free again, you see. Now this is beautiful. And it's come out of walking in this way one day at a time. Now 2 or 3 little things that have been with me almost from the day I got here. Many of you have heard me say it, but I never hear it enough. It's like reading this book of ours. I've got the original manuscript and the first printing and several of the other printings of our big book. And sometimes I read the manuscript and get through with that, and then I pick up the big red book and I read it. And then I pick up the blue one and read it. One right after the other, and there's not much difference, but there's some. Some of the difference I like better in the old version. For instance, I always say in that chapter 3, you know, to learn to enjoy our liquor drinking, you know, in that first paragraph of chapter 3. And it occurred to me that when you read up here the 3rd chapter, it ain't liquor drinking, it's just enjoyed our drinking. So I got back in my big book, my red one, and it says to control and enjoy our liquor drinking. So I like that better, you see. Because that's what I did. I drank liquor. I wasn't much of a beer man and wine man. I tapered off on beer and wine. Bought beer by the case and wine by the gallon to taper off on. That's good tapering, I'll tell you that. Kills a little quicker than the hard stuff. So, it's a learning process, and these things have been with me nearly all the time. Way back, maybe the first 6 months, it could have been a year. Some kid came up to me after a meeting and he says, Chuck, do you know why it's so hard for us to find God? And I didn't want to get into a 2-hour discussion on, you know, finding God, and I wanted to get the hell out of there. I was tired, and he had me cornered. And I had to say to him, no, why is it so hard for us to find God? And he says, because he ain't lost. Because he ain't lost. He says, you see, all we got to do is come back home. And we find God's always been there. We've been away. Now, that ain't bad. I think the great cosmic joke is God hid himself in the last place we ever look. Deep in the middle of our own being, the last place we ever look. And there's where he is, as far as I'm concerned. Shortly after that, there was a chap came through. He was from Flint, Michigan. My type of drunk. He was just my kind of drunk, because he drove his car off of the end of piers and through brick buildings, you know, and stuff like that. And he had one leg about that much longer than the other, and he walked like he was sneaking up on somebody all the time. His name was Big Smith. And Big Smith came limping into a meeting with a plaque under his arm. And he'd found it in a alcoholic ward someplace down in a hospital in Texas. We didn't have any out here at that time, but they seemed to have one. And this is what the plaque said. If you're not as close to God as you once were, or as you would like to be, make no mistake, you're the one that moved. I don't think there's anything much more spiritual than that. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Make no mistake, you're the one that moved. And Smitty says, you see, all we got to do is come back home. And we find that God has always been there. We've been away. Then there's a guy perhaps in this audience right now. 27 years ago, I imagine it was, I had talked in Highland Park. It was a Sunday night meeting. And after the meeting, there were about 4 or 5 of us standing in the middle of the room with our arms on each other's shoulders, saying to each other, how fortunate can a man be? How fortunate can a man be to be returned from the land of the living dead into the land of the living, as we have been? And one of these kids wasn't saying a thing, and finally looked at me and he says, Chuck, I'm ignorant. He said, I ain't never read no books. There's no sense in me reading books because I don't know what they say. I don't know nothing about the Bible, and I don't know nothing about God. This is the essence of every book that was ever written. That we might find a way to live comfortably, peacefully, and joyously with us. That we might feel clean inside and have good things happen in our lives. Love those things. I don't think there's anything any more spiritual than that. It's fantastic as far as I'm concerned. And I, being the kind of guy I am, I've learned much from birds and bees, and animals and trees and fish and stuff like that there. I've learned much from those sources. Sometimes I think more about what to do in life than I've learned from people. Seems like people teach me what not to do. And these sources have taught me much about what to do. For instance, I'll try harder. I was up at the Monterey area many years, 20 years ago, I expect. And we went out to look at some redwood trees. Now, I had seen big trees. You know, I knew what a big tree was. But I had always seen them when I wasn't too interested in what they said to me. Probably 4 sheets in the wind. And this time, I picked up a paper that had in it what I was going to see. And I read it. And we went to see these sights. Well, the first thing we saw was what they called the sister trees. There were 2 trees that had grown across each other like that, you know. And in the wind and turmoil of their lives, they annoyed each other, you know, rubbing against each other that way. And what did they do? They built a natural graft between the 2 of them. Here they are, with a natural graft holding them apart so they didn't bother each other. And I looked at that, and I thought, isn't this fantastic? Here's 2 redwood trees that know enough to grow a thing that keeps them apart. And I thought, God's idea of a redwood must include everything necessary for its fulfillment. And we go ahead and we come to a tree, big one. Oh, this was a big one. And it had been burned out maybe 25 years before, or longer than that perhaps. And some limbs had grown down and in this burn and healed the burn. Now, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it, but you just stand there and see it. And it was a sort of a misty day, and I was pretty misty by this time. And I was standing there in the half rain, crying at the tremendous sermon in this, that God's idea of a redwood tree included limbs growing down. Limbs don't grow down, they grow out and up. But these grew down and in. That burned to heal the burn. And I stood there bawling, thinking, why is it so difficult that we, supposedly God's crowning creation, have so much trouble in abandoning ourselves completely to the living God that made us, even as a redwood tree. Fantastic. Fantastic. Then I got to thinking about the swallows after we moved down there in the area where the swallows come to Capistrano. And I got to thinking about that. And I know that they go many, many miles, maybe a few thousand miles in their migration. And they show up down there at Capistrano on the same day and almost the same time, same minute, year after year after year. On St. Joseph's Day, they show up. Always. Now, where are the maps? You know, who tells them? Where are the traffic cops? You know? They show up. And I had to say to myself, God's idea of a swallow includes everything necessary for its complete fulfillment. Why is it so difficult for us to have the same trust? And then again, I got to thinking about the salmon. The salmon that go from the headwaters of the Klamath River when they get a certain size and go out in the ocean. And they run around out there for 7 years, I think. And they go clear to Japan. They've marked them, and they find them clear over in the Japanese waters, you know. And when the time comes, they come right back to the Klamath River and go right up the Klamath River where they were born, to spawn and to die. Who told them? Where are the road maps in the ocean? Where are the traffic cops? No. God's idea of a salmon includes everything necessary for its complete fulfillment. And here we are, the only segment of God's creation that is disappointed in his handiwork. That think we have to do a job on ourselves in order to be something and somebody. To be this, have that, and be known as. We must do things, you know, to us. We got to be like somebody else. You know, we pick out somebody that we want to be like. Why don't we consider the lilies of the field, how they grow? They toil not, neither do they spin. And I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory is not arrayed like one of these. What's the matter with us? Taking me as a horrible example, I could stand up here and tell you a story like Cleve told us this morning. My ambitions, my great desires, and my disappointments, because just at the pinnacle of success, I was nipped in the bud from the beginning, from the very beginning. Old Walter Camp said the only way I could keep from being an All-American was to get hurt in football. So I did. I came to California in 1922 to commit suicide because I couldn't walk. And I was never supposed to walk because I had an incurable bone disease from an injury in football. I was just before becoming a big success in the business world. And I turned up drunk. I had a beautiful marriage, beautiful kids, and I tore them apart, trying to be somebody else and do something else. And finally, at the ripe old age of 43, I was a failure in every department of life. Failure as a husband, a father, a businessman, a man, and a drunk. And I started trying to rub out a record. 31 years and 9 months ago, because I didn't want my wife and my kids to remember me as nothing but a tongue-chewing, babbling idiot. That's all I've done since. Tried to rub out a record. Now, you can't rub out a record thinking I want or don't want or like or don't like. You rub out a record by doing something for somebody without a price tag on it. And without even knowing again what had happened. My motivation flipped from getting to adding to. And in the last 31 years and 9 months, infinitely more than I ever dreamed of has come into my life. To look at you people this morning, this terrific house full of people. And I know nearly every one of you. And you know me. And I love you. And you love me. And it's impossible. It's impossible. But you see, without knowing what I was doing, I started going about my father's business, which was helping his kids do things they needed to have done. And I found out what the redwood tree and the salmon and the swallows had always known, that underneath are the everlasting arms. And this is the great fact for us. The very doing of the things that our simple little program suggests
opens the doors of heaven and closes the gates of hell. God bless you. Thank you very much.